Dave Sussman back with you at Whiskey Politics, Ricochet.com from FreedomFest, and I'm really excited for this next interview here because we just spoke with Hyperion Knight not just a few weeks ago on our podcast where he was in the Arctic Circle, and we were talking a lot about free markets and music, but we now have him here in person at FreedomFest. Welcome.
Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure to join you here, I have to say.
It's a pleasure to have you as well. So first of all, as a continuation, because as I said to you on our podcast, we could have talked for hours on the subject. Talk about the issues that you're going to be and you have been presenting here at FreedomFest.
Well, it's an exciting time to be among these people, and without going too far overboard with the libertarian thing, it is worth mentioning that Ayn Rand's first big breakthrough novel, The Fountainhead, dealt with exactly the issues we're talking about. An architect striving to create his own kind of art in a world that insisted on government conformity. And in a way, we're all fighting that battle. I have to say that book was actually fundamental in turning me into a conservative/libertarian, because I realized that as artists, we always have this pressure on us to do a certain kind of art to make other people happy or the government happy, and that fight for liberty is fundamental to the life of almost every artist, the spiritual life. So it's great to be able to share this, and the mystery, of course, is why other artists don't seem to understand this, and we have to help educate them that the best way for artists to function is in a way where they can do what they want and not have to try to get a government grant or government committee to approve of their art so that they can live.
Now, when you talk about artists, you can be referring to musicians, artists, actors, and so on and so forth. You're in the music world. You're a virtuoso musician, and as you explained it on our last podcast, and correct me if I'm wrong here, it's kind of a cross between a classic concerto and with options, I guess is...
Right. Yes, exactly.
I mean, your Gershwin is incredible, and then you've got Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you're talking about artists, as generally those, you're speaking about the entire world of
right.
creative souls, yes?
Yes. Well, it's not only every art form, it's also every style within the art form.
Okay.
And in point of fact, we have great geniuses. Let's stick with music for the time being. Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, etc., Tchaikovsky, you can go on and on.
Right.
But classical music was largely destroyed by the tragedy of World War I. European culture, in a sense, self-destructed. And so while there were still a few great classical composers to come, the real creativity suddenly emerged in the United States, where all these magnificent immigrant songwriters, at least songwriters from immigrant families, were suddenly creating this art form called musical theater and jazz. We had this whole body of magnificent music, and then of course the British got into the act in the 60s once the guitar was electrified. And every generation seemed to create new sounds, new ideas that had never been contemplated before. Magnificent thing. And this continued right up until fairly recently. My hat is off to every one of these artists because, in a way, we had our own child prodigies. Like Mozart, we had Stevie Wonder or Prince, people who, from very young ages, had a totally unique vision of music. And we see it in the other art forms as well. But it's all being created by markets now, not by a monarch saying, you're our court musician. Instead, it's people who have a guitar in their garage, or these days a computer, and say, you know what, I can create something here everybody will love, and we all benefit from that.
Wow. Now, what would you suggest is the best way for artists to learn about free markets?
Well, that's an interesting question. I was just talking about this with Naomi Brockwell, who's moderating a lot of the events here at FreedomFest, and she's wonderful about this because she's involved in several different things where she's had to get her own funding. And she really feels artists have to be their own entrepreneurs, and the good news for that is it is possible these days because of technology, because of crowdfunding, and the other ways that you can go on the internet and actually generate support for your artistic endeavors. Every artist can be their own businessman/entrepreneur.
Right.
And this will change everything. There will be no demand that you have to go through a Hollywood studio in order to get a film made. You can get it done with the support of your friends if you have enough of them. And this is going to make art very democratic, and it'll be much harder to sort through it and find out what's truly great and what's not so great. But nonetheless, the options will be infinite.
So there needs to be, and what I'm hearing you say is because when you're dealing with crowdfunding, you basically are surviving based upon your own efforts. There needs to be an investment. There needs to be, you have to take some risk. You have to have some skin in the game.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, in my case, I got a very standard conservatory training, and as soon as I finished it, as soon as I had a doctorate, I decided I don't want to pursue a faculty position or something unless I actually can make a living playing, because I want to understand how I relate to an audience. How does music relate to an audience? And that led me in different artistic directions that greatly enhanced what I do. I was actually just using the same analogy with the great Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who was immortalized in the film, which made him so popular. But Mozart could have found a way to just work as a court musician and create music that only he was interested in doing.
Right.
But instead, he wrote operas that were specifically for a broad public, that were for the riffraff in the streets. Things like The Magic Flute weren't really even classical operas when he wrote them. They were more like musical theater or a show that you might put on at a stadium. And it was so good that we now venerate it as great art. But his intention was to reach the people all along.
Wow. Now, our last podcast, which I don't remember the date, but probably a month or so ago, you were traveling the world as you do. You were above the Arctic Circle, and as we sat down today, you told me that you came from New York, but you were in Poland right around the time that Donald Trump was speaking.
That's right. Yes, it was a delightful thing. After I spoke with you, I'm not sure when I got to Poland, but it was about a week later.
Right.
As Trump was there, and that was a revelation, I have to tell you, because we're often taught to think of ourselves as the ugly American, a lot of anti-Americanism in Western Europe. Well, let me tell you, it does not exist in Central Europe or the Baltic at all. And it was just so wonderful to get there right after the president had been there. I walked into my hotel in Warsaw, and the first thing they said at the front desk was, "Oh, you're from America. You know what? We are able to upgrade you. And as a matter of fact, all the meals are going to be on our hotel." I'd never seen anything like it.
They comped your food and upgraded you simply because you're an American.
That's right.
Because Trump was there.
That's right. And I first thing I did, my prior to traveling, because I eat so much rich food, is to get to the gym. So I went down to the weight room.
Right.
Very nice, probably 18-year-old young Polish man who said, what we loved the most was not just that Trump gave us his support, but that he talked about our history, and he talked about the history of the fight for freedom.
Right.
And this young teenage guy working at a weight room in a hotel got it all. I mean, he was totally on board with everything about the American vision of liberty, and was so excited that we now have a president who's actually willing to go out and say these things and talk about what the fight for freedom means worldwide. And I can assure you, they feel the same way in the Baltic countries, the ones up north, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia.
Right.
And then all the other Central European countries, Hungary, Czech Republic, you name it, they are totally on board with us. And it's a very exciting thing to see.
A recent podcast that I did was with a lady by the name of Melissa O'Sullivan, and she's with the Danube Institute. This was, I think, 1 or 2 episodes after you came on. And folks, you can hear that at whiskeypolitics.net or ricochet.com, shameless plug. But she was talking about the fact that there are now, in fact, 2 Europes, right? You have this progressive socialist leaning, big government, and then you have the Brexit folks. You have the folks that, they want Brexit to happen in France and in Germany and the more free market minded folks. Are you seeing that yourself?
Absolutely. There's no question that in Central Europe and also big parts of Western Europe, where you're finding people voting for things like Brexit that the politicians never saw coming,
right?
A lot of people have decided that nation states need to, first of all, have actual borders, that they need to have a way to enforce the laws. And with all of this comes a real change, a real dynamic that says that you may want to care for poor people, but you also have to have a real system in place that says people either deserve it or they do not, and they either deserve to be in our country or they do not.
Right.
And until you have that, you're going to find the politics in Western Europe totally turmoil.
I mean, is there a will for that to be contained? Because I mean, Macron looks like he seems to be somewhat of a centrist. Merkel is just, let's just open the gates, right? England is trying to figure itself out after the last election. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was a little surprising, not so much. She lurched left before the election. But is there an appetite there to really start to curtail it, or are we looking at the oblivion of the EU as we know it?
Well, actually, both may be true, and let me tell you why I believe that. Okay. And this is partly why Trump was elected. We've been living for a long time in a situation where the government elites have been acting against the majority of the people and their interests, as clearly expressed in votes and otherwise. In England, they've been trying to sabotage the Brexit vote ever since it was passed.
Right.
And so if you visit the heartland of France, you will find vast support for our very traditional liberty-oriented view of the world. But even the politicians in France, by and large, have to defer to those in Brussels. And the EU wants none of this, of course. So you could have a situation where the majority of the people in France and England or even Germany really are yearning for liberty, but because they belong to this EU superstructure, they can't get it. And that's a real danger, and I hope that they're able to overcome it. But it's one that will require some real vigilance.
Yeah. Now, let's get a little bit closer to home here. You're a student of economics, you're a student of politics, you're very, very well traveled. What are you seeing right now happening in Washington, D.C. as it pertains to the political environment right now? Obamacare, tax reform, and things like this. What are your thoughts? I mean, this is getting...
It's incredibly messy, but it's also a little more complicated than we want to acknowledge. Because, for instance, this vote on Obamacare went down because it was opposed both by the most adamant free market people, but also the most kind of middle-of-the-road socialist-leaning Republicans. And
the moderates.
Right, the moderates. And what we're trying to achieve here is not entirely clear yet. I think that clearly the best way for them to proceed is to do what they promised to do in the campaign, which is repeal Obamacare, and then make what really are very hard decisions, let's be honest, about the nature of how much government involvement we want in health care. There's a lot of debate to be had there, but first and foremost, the huge albatross that Obamacare is needs to be gotten rid of, and it was promised in the campaign. Most importantly, it needs to be dealt with first. Now, beyond that, though, I don't actually think that's the most important thing that's going on, because to me, what is fascinating is that the president has decided that he can actually win by picking a fight with the media. Nobody before has ever believed they can do this. Everybody, including Ronald Reagan, George Bush, you name it, has been told, stay away from this battle. You don't want to fight it. They've got the megaphone. Trump doesn't think that's the case. He thinks he can win, and I'll tell you, I travel all around the country. I talk to people constantly. The people are on his side in this fight. For whatever reason, they no longer trust the general media. And even those who didn't necessarily support Trump in the election do not like CNN or the New York Times. They don't believe the truth is being told.
James O'Keefe was sitting in your chair yesterday.
Wow.
All right, Project Veritas.
Yes.
Right? And, he's focused on that fight. Does Trump beat the media?
He does, absolutely. I have yet to see... Sorry, go ahead.
No.
Oh, my polling, what I see from people is that no matter how much they throw at him from the main networks, the mainstream media, none of that is sticking. Now, the administration does need to do the right thing by the people in terms of campaign promises, etc. Our borders need to be defended. We need to get rid of regulations. They are doing these things. If they continue to, if they really succeed here,
right,
it does not matter at all what polls CNN creates to say that he's unpopular. He will be reelected. I can guarantee it.
Right. I can't have you sit here and not talk about music.
Ah, yes.
Obviously, you're incredibly talented, and we're going to have another piece. We had a Gershwin piece at the end of the last podcast that we did by Skype, but we'll put something up. Maybe you can suggest for us to put something up at the end of this one as well. I have to just ask you, because you're so versatile, who are your favorites?
Oh, well, it's interesting you mentioned that. I was raised by a father who had very serious taste. So the most serious Germanic, really, classical music, Beethoven, Bach, and Brahms, was what I was teethed on. But my father was very open-minded. I got to know the great songwriters of the American Songbook. Now, all of these men were geniuses, whether it was Gershwin and his brother Ira, Richard Rodgers and his great songwriter partners Hammerstein and Hart, Jerome Kern, all of the marvelous people, immortalized forever by the singer Frank Sinatra, who made these part of everybody's life in mainstream America. And then, as great as musical theater was and jazz was, they were conquered in short order when Fender and Gibson got the electric guitar out there, and suddenly one man with a guitar could fill a stadium with sound. This changed the whole dynamic. So within a few years, starting with Elvis Presley, you had the Beatles and the Stones completely taking over the musical world. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I've watched throughout my life as everybody's attitudes towards this changed. The founder of modern conservatism, William F. Buckley, in 1964, wrote the nastiest article about the Beatles. Within 4 years, not only had Buckley changed his tune, he and John Lennon had become good friends.
Right.
And by the way, we now know through a film made in in Canada, that by the end of his life, John Lennon actually was supporting Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter in the final election there. Lennon himself had gone through a transformation. It's utterly fascinating. But what I have seen is that from the 60s, where you argued about the Stones or the Beatles being the better group, we got into a time where a lot of connoisseurs really felt Led Zeppelin was the serious rock group, that kind of very serious metal was the best. But now, almost everyone's favorite band when I travel around the world is Queen. So you find these are the groups that have kind of emerged as the most popular icons of the rock pop era. It's astonishing to watch it shift. That is not, by the way, to ignore Billy Joel or Elton John, who were not bands, but as solo songwriters were just as great as George Gershwin or Schubert in their own way.
It's interesting because you talk about free markets, you talk about John Lennon. There was a quote that said, I think Paul McCartney said it, that if they wanted to buy another swimming pool, they just wrote another song.
Yes. You know, what it must be like to experience that kind of success. I hope we all find out.
Right.
This is actually a great cosmic injustice, because the great songwriters like Gershwin and especially Irving Berlin, who lived to be over 100 years old, were suddenly more or less obsolete after the rock and roll invasion, after the British invasion. Whereas a lot of these rock and rollers never intended to make music past the age of 30. They never even really took it seriously, but now they are knights and lords of the realm in Britain, and they still are playing in their 70s to packed stadiums. That's amazing.
No, I mean, the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, they all thought if they get 5 years, they're lucky.
Right.
And I just watched Robert Plant do something a few weeks ago live. It was incredible. I mean, he's still got the voice. So, it really is amazing. So where do people find you, Hyperion?
My website, HyperionKnight.com, tells where I'm performing.
Okay.
And I used to play every night in Manhattan at the Rainbow Room, but I tour all the time now. So it's actually rather hard to find me, but on my website it shows which orchestra I'm playing with or which cruise ship I'm playing concerts on. And, I would certainly hope that any of Whiskey Politics followers who might be in the area would come up to say hello to me if they should have a chance to see me play, because I'd love to meet them.
Well, I got to tell you, you got a lot of really nice feedback from your fans on the Facebook page.
Oh, that's great to hear.
After our last podcast. So there was a few people on there that says they definitely want to come to FreedomFest to visit you. So you have a following.
Oh,
you have a following. So greatly appreciate you taking the time again to sit down. I know that you're busy here at FreedomFest. Follow Hyperion at HyperionKnight.com and listen to his music. You can find him on YouTube as well. He's all over the place. incredible. Which piece do you want at the end?
For this next show, I would say, let's do the Beethoven Ninth Symphony. Why not?
Nice.
Yes, we'll go with the very best.
Go so old school here.
Yeah,
All
exactly.
right. Hyperion, thank you so much.
Such a
greatly
pleasure, Dave.
Appreciate it. Likewise. And you can continue to follow us at whiskeypolitics.net, at ricochet.com, and please subscribe to our podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, where your 5-star rating will help others find us. We'll see you again soon, right here at Whiskey Politics. Take care.